They laughed when I said nothing. My niece's fiancé raised his glass and smirked. "You're in the Navy, that's adorable." The whole table joined in like it was some harmless joke. My sister's eyes warned me, "Don't ruin the moment, Blanche." So I smiled just like I always did, swallowing the heat rising in my chest. But something cracked that night, a quiet, clean break inside me that would never quite heal. After years of being dismissed, of shrinking myself to make them comfortable, I finally realized the truth. They didn't know my name was Blanche Crawford, and they had no idea who they were laughing at. I've never cared for receptions, the kind where people laugh louder than they need to and say things they don't mean. Still, that night I was there. It was my niece Molly's engagement dinner in Napa Valley, a glittering vineyard hall wrapped in candlelight and jazz. The air smelled of red wine and polished vanity. Every guest seemed to perform as if applause waited at the end of each polite sentence. I stayed near the bar alone, wrapped in a simple navy dress. No uniform, no medals, no insignia. Just me, the family's quiet afterthought, the odd one out who never fit their version of success. Molly's voice carried over the music, bright and careless. "Everyone, this is my Aunt Blanche. She's in the Navy, something with logistics, I think." A soft ripple of laughter followed. Her fiancé, Ethan Lowell, raised his glass, grinning like he'd just tossed a harmless joke into the room. "That's adorable. So you handle shipping forms." I smiled the way a soldier does before a storm, and took a slow sip of wine. It was warm and rich, but a sharp bitterness spread through my throat, a familiar taste I'd learned to swallow over the years. No one at that table knew that 6 hours earlier I'd signed deployment orders, moving an entire carrier group out of Guam for a rescue mission in the South China Sea. No one knew that I had commanded more people than this room would ever hold, and none of them cared to know. To them, I was just the harmless aunt, with a safe little Navy desk job, someone who'd aged gracefully into irrelevance. I caught my sister's glance from across the room, a flicker of embarrassment masked as a smile. She looked relieved I was quiet, relieved I wasn't about to say anything that might ruin their perfect evening. In my family, success was only celebrated if it didn't make anyone uncomfortable. So I smiled, I listened, I let them laugh. But under that calm surface, something began to shift, a quiet, precise break I could almost hear. They had no idea that the woman they were mocking had once commanded the seas they drank to. Let them laugh, I thought. Tonight wouldn't end with jazz. A week before the dinner, my office phone rang. It was Helen. Her voice always carried that same mix of pity and authority, the sound of someone who had decided long ago that she knew what was best for everyone else. She didn't ask how I'd been or where I was calling from. She went straight to her concern. "Don't wear your uniform to the reception." "Okay, it's too harsh. People might feel uncomfortable. And Ethan's father will be there, Richard Lowell. You've heard of him?" I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the glowing map of the Pacific across the wall. The lines of movement, the coded coordinates, the quiet hum of power. All of it so far removed from Helen's world of charity galas and holiday cards. I answered simply, "I have." When the call ended, I opened my encrypted terminal and typed a few words into the defense database. Contractor Lowell Dynamics, Project Atlas, under review for data breach. A single line of text blinked on screen, cold and precise, but it made me smile. The man my sister was so eager to impress was the same man whose company sat under active investigation by my command. I didn't tell her. I didn't need to. I only texted back later that night. "Don't worry, Helen. I'll be polite." She had no idea she'd just asked a vice admiral to hide her rank to avoid offending a man I could have summoned to a federal hearing. I didn't have to plan revenge, I just had to wait. Sometimes silence arranges its own consequences. The night before the reception, I sat by the window of my apartment in San Diego. The harbor lights shimmered against the black water, the rhythm of the waves steady as a heartbeat. The air smelled of salt and diesel, familiar grounding. When I was 16, our father died and Helen inherited the family spotlight. She became the perfect Crawford daughter, private school white dresses, Sunday luncheons. I was the other one, the girl who watched ships instead of boys. Our mother used to sigh and say, "A girl in uniform will scare away good men." She wasn't wrong. I never married, but I didn't regret a single thing. That choice took me across the world to the Sulu Sea, where I commanded a rescue operation that pulled 42 hostages from a hijacked freighter. No headlines, no medals. The mission was classified before dawn. The greatest moment of my career, something I could never speak of. In my family, they celebrated magazine features and stock photos from charity events. I'd saved lives and they'd never even noticed. That was when I understood I lived in two separate worlds, one built on image, the other on truth. Helen belonged to the first. I had given my life to the second. I turned off the lamp and watched the faint blue of the harbor pulse in the distance. If they wanted me to stay quiet again, fine. But this time my silence would be deliberate. This time, I would choose how the truth came to surface. I arrived earlier than anyone expected. Candles flickered across the long table, their reflections bleeding into the surface of red wine like slow-moving trails of blood. The air in Napa Valley was heavy with the kind of politeness that stifled truth, every smile calculated, every handshake carrying a hidden transaction. I took a seat at the far end of the table, close enough to listen, distant enough to observe. Helen floated among the guests, radiant in her practiced charm, clinging to Richard Lowell's arm, as though she'd found her ticket to social immortality. Richard himself had the look of a man accustomed to authority, silver-haired deliberate posture, and eyes that had issued orders, but never faced the consequences of them. When his gaze finally met mine, he smiled the kind of smile rich men wear when they believe they've already won. "So you work with ships, I hear." "Must be a stressful desk job." I set my glass down, felt the warmth of the stem under my fingers. "Sometimes," I said, "but it keeps people alive." He laughed short and shallow. The others joined in the sound, bouncing off the crystal and silverware. Helen quickly interjected, her tone sugar-coated with embarrassment. "Oh, she handles logistics. She's not the combat type." The conversation drifted on, leaving me in the wake of their casual dismissal. I stayed still, eyes on the silver watch glinting on Richard's wrist, a black-faced timepiece engraved with the Wardwell Systems insignia. A contractor once suspended for falsifying radar data. That file had crossed my desk 2 years ago. Now it gleamed right in front of me. I took a quiet breath, keeping my pulse steady. Silence, I reminded myself, has always been my sharpest weapon. Later, as a server refilled glasses, an older man down the table squinted at me. "Vice Admiral Crawford. I served under you in Yokosuka, didn't I?" Every fork paused mid-air. Helen laughed too loudly, her pitch cracking slightly. "He must be mistaken. My sister's not that kind of Navy." I turned to the knee and the glass slowly, watching the red light shimmer across the tablecloth. "He's not mistaken," I said softly, but the words reached every corner of the room. The jazz band faltered. The air went still, Helen's eyes cut to me sharp with warning. Richard studied me again, closer this time, like he'd just glimpsed something he couldn't quite name but instinctively feared. And in that silence, I felt it, the first tremor of a storm they didn't yet know was coming. The evening dragged on, wrapped in its own pretense. The clinking of silverware and the bursts of shallow laughter worked like perfume, masking the rot underneath. I had stayed silent long enough. Ethan, still eager to impress, leaned toward me with a smirk. "Maybe you could help decorate the ship's Aunt Blanche. You seem to have a good eye for design." Helen's laugh came too quickly, too bright, a lifeboat tossed into rising water. Richard chuckled beside her, but his glance flicked to me, searching for a reaction. I let the pause stretch, turning my wineglass once between my palms before speaking. "I already did. I designed how they move." The words cut through the chatter like a blade. The music stopped mid-note. Every pair of eyes turned to me. Richard blinked, lips parting, his confidence draining in slow motion. Helen swallowed hard, color draining from her face. Molly stared at me, as if she was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. Richard set his glass down carefully, the stem trembling. "You have quite a sense of humor, Ms. Crawford." I met his gaze without blinking. "Not really. My job doesn't leave much room for jokes." Beneath the table, Helen's hand found mine, gripping tightly. "Please, Blanche, don't make this weird." I pulled my hand free. "It's already weird, Helen. You just never noticed." No one dared speak. The silence grew heavy, pressing against the walls, until even the chandelier seemed to hum with tension. A few guests whispered forced pleasantries to each other, pretending not to feel the shift, but the damage had been done. Richard turned away, muttered something to a waiter, asked for more wine. Helen smiled again, brittle, and strained her hand, shaking as she raised her glass. I leaned back, feeling the calm settle over me, like a steady tide. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to prove anything. The truth was already doing its work. Sometimes the most terrifying sound in a room is the absence of laughter. And as I looked at them, all the people who'd spent a lifetime underestimating me, I realized they were finally quiet. Not because they respected me, but because they were afraid of what they might learn next. I left the table not out of anger, but because the moment had ripened. On the balcony, the night air moved through the vines, cool and indifferent. I thumbed my encrypted phone and keyed a brief command to Ruiz bring the Atlas file. Full dress uniform, arrive quietly. His reply came back in 2 words, understood, ma'am. The tone was a bolt. It landed where it needed to. Back inside, Helen smiled as if my quiet meant surrender. See? She mouthed to Richard. He relaxed and raised his glass loud and pleased. A toast to the brave men protecting our seas, he declared, and the chorus answered. I let them cheer. I did not lift my glass. You forgot the women. I said, my voice measured. A few embarrassed laughs broke out. Ethan tried to cover, joking that of course women too, especially in logistics. Helen shot me a hard look. I tilted the corner of my mouth. Yes, logistics keep fleets from sinking, I said, and the words landed like a cold splash. Richard blinked, flirted with amusement, and told me my work must be important. You'll find out soon, I answered. Beneath the small talk, the air shifted. A text slid across my screen. From Ruiz arrived. Standing by. I balanced the glass, looked around at their oblivious faces. Helen gossiping with a neighbor, Richard polishing his anecdotes, Molly laughing because Molly always laughed. They felt safe in their ignorance. I thought compliance isn't surrender. It's camouflage. Tonight, I would show them what that camouflage really meant. Around 9, the music slowed. Couples drifted to the floor, and the hall softened into warm light. I sat still, holding my wine, waiting for the next act in a play they thought they directed. A white beam cut through the doorway, and the room turned. Commander Ruiz entered in dress white's gloves, crisp, carrying a locked case. He walked straight to my chair and announced in a voice that filled the space, Vice Admiral Crawford, ma'am. You have a secure call with the Secretary regarding Project Atlas. The glass in Richard's hand slipped. It hit the parquet and shattered with a sound that left no room for pretense. Helen went pale. Richard stammered, Vice. Admiral? I rose, smoothed my skirt, and met him without flinch. That's correct. I oversee your contracts, Mr. Lowell. Ruiz placed the case on the table and opened it like a judge presenting evidence. Music died, laughter evaporated. The reception had become an impromptu briefing. The luxury around us felt suddenly fragile, paper thin. Admiral, I didn't realize Richard tried. No, I interrupted. You chose not to realize. Ethan froze mid-smile. Molly's face changed, something like understanding and shame warring there. Helen stood, hands trembling, attempting salvage. Blanche. This is not appropriate, she began. Neither is lying to impress a criminal contractor. I replied, voice low. Ruiz remained rigid at my back, the white of his uniform, a stark bar of truth against the warm gilding of the room. Richard's bravado drained. He straightened in a reflex that looked almost like salute. Admiral, the Secretary is waiting on your review notes, Ruiz said. Tell him I'll call from the car, I answered. I walked away, and my heels struck the floor in a steady metronome. Behind me, people who had laughed at me sat silent, watching the wreckage of their ease. A second glass fell and burst a punctuation mark on the end of a social order that had just been rewritten. No one stood. No one spoke. Only the echo of Ruiz's footsteps filled the silence as he pulled a chair for me to sit right there at the dinner table. The glittering hall lost its charm in an instant. It felt like a war room disguised in crystal and linen. Candlelight flickered over the red letters stamped across the folder, classified. The guests who had toasted with Richard Lowell minutes earlier now stared down at their plates. I began evenly, my voice cold and precise. Mr. Lowell, the data from Project Atlas shows major discrepancies. Your company's performance metrics don't align with Navy systems. Richard froze. Helen gripped her napkin so tightly, her nails left marks in the fabric. You'll correct the issue by next quarter, I continued, or your contracts will be suspended pending investigation. Ruiz unfolded another file and spoke firmly. Ma'am, the secretary requested your preliminary remarks for Monday's committee. He'll have them, I replied. I met Richard's eyes. And one more thing, teach your son to respect before he speaks. Ethan looked down, his face the color of wine. Molly's eyes shimmered. Helen tried to form words, but none came. Richard swallowed hard. Yes, Admiral. Of course. We'll cooperate fully. Ruiz closed the folder and saluted. Admiral, the car is ready. Thank you, Commander. I rose, slipped on my coat, and turned to the room. Good evening, everyone. No one moved. The gold braid on my shoulder caught the light, a quiet authority they'd never understand. Behind me, a glass shattered, and I wondered if someone had dropped it, or if a world had just broken apart. A month later, I was back in Washington, the cold light of the Pentagon reflecting off every white surface as I walked through the endless corridors. The air there always carried the same quiet tension, discipline, secrecy order. On the long table in the conference room lay a stack of files stamped in bold black, Project Atlas, Performance Review. The oversight board was already seated when I entered. General Peterson looked up, his voice steady but approving. Vice Admiral Crawford, good work on the Atlas exposure. I nodded. Thank you, sir. Short, professional. Nothing more was needed. No one mentioned Napa Valley. No one even suspected what had happened there, and that was fine. In my world, honor didn't need an audience. The report's conclusions sat clearly on the first page. Lowell Dynamics fully cooperated. Internal systems now exceed Navy benchmarks. Richard Lowell had kept his company, but he'd lost the arrogance that once defined him. The kind of loss that leaves no scar, but changes a man all the same. He'd learned what humility feels like without me having to teach it. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived at my office through diplomatic channels. It bore no government seal, no formal header. Just my name, handwritten in black ink. Inside was a letter on simple stationery. Vice Admiral Crawford. Thank you for allowing us to make it right. My son Ethan enlisted in the Navy last week. He says he wants to learn what real leadership means. Richard Lowell. I read it twice then, a third time. Not because it pleased me, but because it settled something deep inside, a quiet confirmation that true restitution never comes from punishment, but from realization. I slid the letter into the top drawer of my desk, beside my father's old insignia, the one I'd kept since the day he died. He used to say the sea humbles those who believe they command it. Standing there, the sound of muffled footsteps echoing through the hallway, I finally understood what he meant. The man who once mocked my girly Navy job had sent his son to wear the same uniform he'd laughed at. There was no need for revenge. The tide had already turned, and the lesson delivered. The sunset in San Diego burned gold, the kind of gold that doesn't glitter, but glows forged from salt metal and time. I stood on the pier watching the ships stretch across the horizon, their silhouettes solid and still against the fading light. The sea wind was sharp with salt, tugging at the hem of my white coat, the same way it always did before a departure. Beneath the dock, the small waves slapped against steel hulls, steady as a heartbeat, familiar, grounding alive. My phone buzzed in my pocket. One new message. We're proud of you, Blanche. Molly asked me to say that. From Helen. I stared at the words. Once those few lines might have undone me. Years ago, I might have cried at the idea that my sister had finally said she was proud. But now, standing there with the Pacific blazing under the last light of day, I felt only a quiet calm. I smiled small real and turned off the screen. Some acknowledgments arrive too late to matter, yet right on time to confirm that you no longer need them. I slipped the phone away and lifted my eyes toward the open water. The sun sank lower, an ember melting into the horizon. They mocked my Navy job, I thought, but the Navy made me who I am. A gull cut across the sky, its white wings catching the final light before fading into the deepening blue. Behind me, the sound of boots on steel echoed softly. Ruiz stood a few steps away, his cap tucked under his arm, posture straight and sure. "Ma'am, your ship is ready," he said. I turned toward him, nodding once. "Let's go!" I climbed the steel steps, the rhythm of my heels steady, echoing like a drumline against the metal. Each step carried the weight of everything that had come before and the freedom that followed. The deck rose to meet me, the faint hum of engines vibrating beneath my feet. I could smell oil and sea, hear the low murmur of sailors preparing for departure. Behind me, the Navy flag unfurled, snapping hard in the evening wind. The golden light poured over it, spilling across my shoulder like a benediction. For a long moment, I just stood there, no rank, no pretense, no audience, only the woman I had become, looking out at the life she had built with her own quiet defiance. And in that silence, there was peace. Not the kind you find after victory, but the kind you earn when you stop needing to prove you've won.